Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at later medieval laws, part of the Crime and Punishment series. The first thing we're going to consider is King Henry II. Henry became King of England in 1154, and he had a significant impact on the law in England. He's probably most famous for the murder of Thomas Becket, which happened during his reign. One change, known as the Assize of Clarendon, organised prisons for those awaiting trial. But understand that these prisons were not the punishment in themselves. It was very rare to be sentenced to imprisonment and that being your punishment. Instead, these were secure areas where people who were accused of crimes could be confined while they were awaiting a fair trial, or at least as fair as medieval England could offer them. Under Henry, the law became more unified and centralised, further increasing the power of the king compared to Norman times when this had already increased. Henry and later kings sent out written orders to county sheriffs. These were known as writs. Because they carried the king's seal, they were considered the actual word of the king, and so were very well obeyed. Henry also introduced justices in eyre, where judges were appointed by the king. They would visit the county twice a year and hear the most serious cases. This freed up the king to govern in other ways, and yet still shows the centralised nature of the king's rule. Just like in earlier times, changes in the law at this time are represented by both change and continuity, and we're going to consider continuity first. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, towns and cities were growing. London had a population of over 30,000 people, and York in the north of England had a population over 11,000 people. Although these would represent very small settlements today, they represented huge settlements for the time, given the smaller population in England. This meant that it was harder to identify individual criminals within these places, and there were more opportunities for crime. However, some older systems remained in place, because basically they worked. Areas called wards were established in urban areas, and although this was a change, it still represented an aspect of community justice, because local people were expected to arrest criminals and hand them over, much as they had been in Norman and Saxon times. Manor courts, especially in rural areas, continued to sort out disputes between a lord and his subjects. And constables were appointed as officials to enforce the law, but their role was little changed from the earlier tithing men. Now we're going to consider some of the new laws that were introduced, and these represent change. The first new law we're going to consider was called the Statute of Labourers. The Black Death was a terrible plague that struck Europe in the 14th century, arriving in England in 1348. This was a terrible pandemic, and it may have killed as many as a third to a half of all the people in England. That can't happen without significant change to society, and that's precisely what happened. The disease killed so many people that it led to a shortage of labourers on farms to bring in the vital harvest. This encouraged surviving peasants to be increasingly aware of their value, and they challenged their lords by asking for higher wages, or they might threaten to move to other estates where perhaps the paying conditions were better. This represented a threat to the social order. This is what is said in the Rochester Chronicle, written in 1350, in the immediate aftermath of the Black Death. There was such a shortage of agricultural workers and labourers that churchmen, knights and other worthies have been forced to thresh their corn, plough the land and perform every other unskilled task. The idea of people higher up in the feudal system than peasants doing agricultural labouring was a necessity of survival at this time, but it certainly upset the power structures, and it couldn't be allowed to stand. This led Parliament to pass the Statute of Labourers. That's an important point. It was Parliament that passed it, not directly the king. The law set the maximum wage and made it illegal for workers to ask for a pay rise. It also became illegal to move from one area to another, seeking better working conditions. This does represent some continuity. Like the forest laws, this law protected the power of the powerful. But this also represents change. This law was passed by Parliament rather than just by the king. It shows that Parliament's lawmaking was becoming more important. Our next big change are the heresy laws. Heresy is when a person holds different beliefs to the dominant religion. In the 13th and 14th centuries, a small minority of people began to challenge the practices and beliefs of the Christian Church. Translating the Bible into English was one thing that they did, so that non-clergy or non-church people like priests could read and interpret it for themselves. Questioning the miraculous nature of the bread and wine in the Mass too. Catholic belief believed in something called transubstantiation. This is where it was believed that as part of the Mass, a miracle occurred, where the bread and wine literally became the blood and body of Christ. Some people began to see it more as an act of remembrance of the Last Supper, and they challenged this belief. The Catholic Church were unprepared to accept this change, and so they fought back against it. Kings had long relied on the support of the Church for their power, and so heresy laws were passed in 1382, 1401 and 1414. These laws showed that the secular rule of the king and the power of the Church could rule together. Justices of the peace arrested suspected heretics. They were part of the secular or non-religious setup. But then church courts would put the defendants on trial. This shows again the rule of the Church. But then once someone was found guilty by the church courts, they were handed over to the secular or non-religious authorities, who carried out sentencing and punished those who were found guilty. This might include some very severe punishments indeed, and it could include, as shown here, burning at the stake from 1401. This was both a deterrent, it was such an awful way to die that it would put people off becoming heretics, but it was also supposed to symbolise the purifying of the soul. This showed both the secular movements and the Church working together in order to enforce the law. Our final points then. Medieval law represented a mix of change and continuity. Continuity included the continued use of community justice in arresting criminals, but now introduced wards as areas of the growing towns and cities which people had local responsibility for. Also the continued use of manor courts to settle local disputes, and the use of constables, which was very similar to the use of tithing men in local areas. But there were changes too. One was the Statute of Labourers. This outlawed peasants moving to new areas and asking for higher wages, and this preserved the power of the ruling classes in the aftermath of the social upheaval of the Black Death. Heresy laws were also introduced. They showed both secular and church authorities cooperating to put down anyone questioning the Church, people known as heretics. The king also extended his power over the law by the use of the justices in eyre and the prisons for those awaiting trial, what was known as the Assize of Clarendon. Both were introduced by Henry II. So that gives a very brief overview of some of the new laws which were introduced in the later medieval period and some of the things that continued. I hope that this has been useful to you, and if it has, please do subscribe to the channel, like this video, and if you're desperate for me to include something else on this course, pop it in the comments below and I'll see what I can do. But for now, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.